Topping have been engaged in an arms race for quite some time now. Sometimes the race is with themselves, other times it's with competitors like SMSL, Loxji and Savage. These are all manufacturers from the Shenzhen district in China, known for the rapid development cycles of new products and sometimes questionable commercial practices like stealing products from other brands in other countries and then iterating them to try to make improvements. But we don't need to muddy the waters with deeper discussion of that right now. And it is fair to say that some of those practices have rapidly advanced the quality of affordable audio products over recent years, regardless of the ethical or moral considerations that are a different conversation. Why this local pool of competition is specifically relevant here is that it's produced the arms race that I'm talking about. Each of these brands is constantly trying to outdo the other to produce the very best possible DAC. And by best possible DAC, I mean the DAC that has the best measurements in terms of things like total harmonic distortion and SINAD. This competition has spilled over into other brands and other countries as well, with even American brands like Schiit Audio and Jasheli Labs publishing their measurements of their product and in some cases producing specifically measurement-based products to show just how well their products stack up against these Chinese hyper-DACs. Well, Topping have just gone one better than all of them and produced the best DAC ever made, according to THD and SINAD scores. Using a pair of ES9039 Pro DAC chips, along with a new current to voltage conversion stage and a special chip to help improve the jitter and the jitter rejection from the clocking process, the Topping D90 III DAC now delivers total harmonic distortion of just 0.0000045%. Hopefully I got the right number of zeros in there. That is, of course, unless you use the more conventional 4V outputs rather than the 5V outputs that they chose to take these measurements on. Now 5V is fine if the amplifier that you're running is able to accept 5V, but that will cause clipping on some devices, and 4V is much more of an industry standard. Another thing that might change the distortion figures is the fact that you can switch on in the D90 3 different sound modes. One of them is the default, which will give you those sorts of figures, but you can also deliberately add distortion in the form of a transistor or a tube mode. That just means slightly different distortion being added to deliberately colour the sound. But that would be a deliberate choice to switch on those modes if you don't want the purest, cleanest possible signal. And I think all of this is absolutely remarkable. I also think it's completely irrelevant. At this point in the DAC design race, we're well past the stage of any of these THD or SINAD improvements equating to anything that's in any way an audible sonic improvement. It's now become an exercise in theory, not really in practice. It's kind of like producing a tyre for a car that's able to withstand speeds of 600 kilometers an hour when there's no car on the planet that can go that fast. But then maybe these largely irrelevant numbers actually hide a different truth. Maybe the optimizations required to create such insane distortion figures will also happen to result in some other changes in the DAC circuits that actually are audible. The Topping D90 Mark III costs $899. For around that sort of money, there are a lot of excellent DACs. Let's meet some of them. The EverSolo DAC-Z8 costs $699, and it uses the previous generation of the same chip that's in the D90 Mark III. In this case, we're talking about the ES9038 Pro, so the previous generation from the 9039 that's in the D90, and it only uses one of them compared to the 2 chips in the D90. According to the marketing, the DAC-Z8 also has its own fancy current to voltage conversion process, and it comes in with THD scores of about 0.00007% if you're using a 4V XLR output, because you can't use 5V from the DAC-Z8. Next, we've got Topping's own D70 Pro OCTO DAC. That retails for $599, and it uses 8 CS43198 DAC chips from Cirrus Logic. It also produces more distortion than either of the previous two DACs we mentioned, and whilst it can run a 5V XLR output, which generally improves things, even with the 5V output running, it's still getting distortion figures of 0.00007%, similar to the DAC-Z8 running in 4V mode. Hopefully you're still with me here. The final DAC that I've brought into this comparison is the Schiit Bifrost 2. It's the new 264 version, and that comes in at $799 or $829 if you want the silver finish. The current version of the Bifrost 2, which was updated a couple of years back now if my timing memory is serving me correctly, the current version uses 4 DAC 8812 chips from Texas Instrument, and it's a completely different approach to decoding audio. It's using a multi-bit approach as opposed to a more traditional Delta Sigma approach, which, yes, technically is still multi-bit, but let's not get into that conversation here. What we need to know for this conversation is that it's more of a pure Delta Sigma approach in the first three DACs I've talked about, and it's more of a custom multi-bit approach designed by Schiit Audio for the Bifrost 264. The Bifrost 2 has easily the worst total harmonic distortion figures from the DACs we're considering in this lineup, and it comes in with a distortion, again on a 4V XLR output, of 0.00008%. And so whilst I did say it was the worst of the lot, if you were to run the D70 Pro OCTO on the 4V output and measure it there, which I haven't seen measurements for the 4V outputs, you're probably going about the same between the Bifrost 2 and the D70 Pro OCTO. Again though, none of these figures necessarily mean much because we can't hear that level of difference between distortion that's so low. Looking just at the DACs that I've mentioned so far, the D90 III has a couple of nice features going for it. It comes with a Bluetooth remote control, which means that you can actually hide the DAC away. You don't need line of sight in order to control it with your remote control. It also gets you an I2S input, which none of the others that I'm talking about here have. Although having said that, I had all sorts of problems with noise from the Topping D90 III I2S input. That was running it from the EverSolo DAC-Z8 streamer. I tried multiple different pin configurations. I manually worked my way through and confirmed that every single setting was correct for I2S. And I've also used the DAC-Z8 feeding I2S just recently into the LAIV Harmony DAC with no issues at all. It sounded glorious. But with the D90 III, I could not get a sound out of that DAC via I2S that didn't have electronic noise coming along with the signal. It worked fine from every other input, and I also tried disconnecting all possible cables other than the ones I needed in case it was coming in from elsewhere. I couldn't get it to work. Take that information with a grain of salt. I still don't know where the noise was coming from, but it was a bit concerning to me that a $900 DAC was causing me so much trouble when other DACs that I've plugged in with I2S to the DAC-Z8 worked no problems at all. The D90 III does also offer 12V trigger. What that means is you can have the DAC switch on and or switch other devices on using a single 3.5mm to 3.5mm cable. The idea of that is you can switch on one device in your chain and it will trigger the switching on or off of all of the other devices in the chain as needed. It's really handy, it's a great feature, but it's also on the D70 Pro OCTO for way less money. If we then look at the other DACs in this lineup, the D70 Pro OCTO offers a wonderful looking interface, a great screen, a great display, a great menu system, and then the EverSolo DAC-Z8 does the same thing and possibly does it even better. The Bifrost 2 is probably the odd one out here in terms of interface, in that it's got no display, it's got very basic rudimentary features, but in that respect it's probably the easiest one to set up and get your music playing faster. Enough of all that though, because you want to know the same thing that I did. Comparing the D90 III and the OCTO on the opening passages of All and Raid, and they're completely indistinguishable. As the track continues, they're still indistinguishable. I did start to notice as I spent longer between these two DACs, there was a tiny hint of something different about the two DACs on the kick bass in this track, but it was so subtle and so intangible that I can't even really describe to you what I was hearing. It was just somehow a little bit different. And on that note, it might have been in my head. If I did have to pick one difference that I am fairly confident about, it seemed to me that when I went over to the OCTO each time, it was coming across a little bit more aggressive or energetic in the top end. If anything, I actually expected that from the D90 III, not from the OCTO, so this went against my expectations. But at the same time, it was very, very subtle. And so I'd say that I'm 51% certain that the OCTO has that slightly different character to the sound, but I'm also 49% open to the fact that I could be making this up. Let's move on though to the DAC-Z8 and the D90 III, so I can tell you that, once again, these were no easy to differentiate, at least not at first. Once the hand claps begin in All and Raid at about the 40-second mark, that's where I did start to hear a difference. The DAC-Z8 in that section comes across just a little bit smoother and perhaps a tiny bit less resolving. I also felt like the D90 Mark III was giving me a little bit more sense of the room in this recording. It comes across as being a slightly more resolving and transparent DAC, but slightly. The Bifrost 2, on the other hand, offers something a little bit different. From the Bifrost 2, you get notes that are a bit more rounded. I don't mean rounded as in rolled off or smoothed off, I mean you can actually hear a sense of shape within space. What it also shows is that the D90 soundstage is also much flatter. Now those hand claps that I mentioned before, it's like the hand clapping is happening right next to the vocalist, whereas on the Bifrost 2, it's like the hand claps are a little bit behind the vocalist. Those same hand claps are a bit less prominent from the Bifrost 2, and some will feel like the D90 is therefore more resolving and bringing forward more detail than the Bifrost 2, but the way I hear it is that it's like on the Bifrost 2, the hand claps are happening behind the singer a little bit, and therefore the volume and the intensity of those sounds drops off a little bit before it gets to me as the listener, compared to the vocalist who's closer doesn't drop off as much. To me, that's a more natural sound. To other people, they're going to like the intensity that all sounds get from the D90 Mark III, regardless of whether it's a background sound or a foreground sound. As I thought about both of these DACs and compared them to real life, the Bifrost 2 sounded like sitting at a live performance in a fairly intimate space. The D90 Mark III sounded like a brilliant recording of each individual track that was then stitched together all in one line from left to right, with each instrument placed on the same plane. But that's only one track, so let's try some different music, something a bit more complex. Staying with the D90 Mark III and the Bifrost 2, and once again the D90 Mark III had a very flat presentation. It sounded like all the musicians and the soloist were seated in a straight line at the front of the stage. Switching to the Bifrost 2 made it sound like the lead violinist or the soloist had taken a step forward, hopefully not off the front of the stage, but taken a step forward and therefore created some depth between the solo violin passage and all the ensemble that were accompanying her. The tonality from the Bifrost 2 was also just a hair warmer than it was from the D90 Mark III, but not to the degree that I'd say that the Bifrost 2 comes across coloured. It's not warm or rich in any way. I think all that's really happening is that slight difference in presentation, the slight difference in sense of depth in the soundstage means that there is that little bit of fall off from the sounds in the background, and that just smooths things out a little tiny bit, but it is very, very subtle. This track also served to show that the DAC-Z8 from EverSolo is a bit less resolving than the D90 Mark III, and that's particularly true in the upper registers where the DAC-Z8 comes across a little bit rolled off, a little bit smoother up top, a little bit less resolving compared to the D90 Mark III. But on the other hand, the DAC-Z8 brought a sense of weight and body to the mid-range that I was really enjoying. To my ears as an ex-violinist, I was liking the sense of resonance and richness that the violin had from the DAC-Z8, even though it was trading off a little bit of the texture of things like the bow on the string. It's one of those cases where we can't know what is actually correct or right or in the original recording, and so this one's going to come down to what you like. That's all that matters. Moving then to the D70 Pro OCTO again, and comparing it to the D90 Mark III, the OCTO had the same natural and slightly more resonant character to the sound that the DAC-Z8 did, but in this occasion, there was no loss of resolution. The OCTO just had a slightly better sense of weight and body in the mid-range, whilst keeping everything else exactly the same. It's probably worth noting at this point that all of what I'm describing was running the Burson Soloist 3X GT, that's the deluxe version with the SPO2 modules and the supercharger power supply, and that was connected up using Supra Sword XLR interconnects from both the DACs into the Soloist GT, and the headphones I used for this test were the Mesolyric 2. And I share that with you to say that synergy will play a part in this. You shouldn't make a purchasing decision based on this one description, because exactly which one I preferred is partly about my tastes, it's also about the source chain that I was using it on. But what it tells us is that there are some subtle differences between all four of these DACs. And to me, the D90 Mark III sometimes came across sounding a touch clinical or a touch sterile, particularly when compared to something like the D70 Pro OCTO. For me, the D70 Pro OCTO did everything the D90 Mark III did, but it also sounded a little bit better, a little bit more resonant, a little bit weightier in the mid-range. And so the OCTO consistently matched the D90 Mark III for resolution, for detail, and for staging, but it delivered everything with a sense of authority and weight that I preferred. The whole ensemble felt more powerful and full from the OCTO. It sounded again more like a live sound versus a recorded sound from the D90 Mark III. I think perhaps the D90 Mark III still does separate sounds just a little bit better than the OCTO, so the ability to hear each individual instrument in space might be just a touch stronger from the D90 Mark III, but that also seemed to depend on where in the frequency range that sound resides. The D90 Mark III is very, very good in the upper mid-range through treble in terms of extracting detail and texture, but I think as you get down more into the mid-range and bass, the OCTO is just as good and possibly even slightly better. And so at this point, I wonder if you're taking from what I've said so far the same things that I did. Topping might be leading their particular arms race with the D90 Mark III, but they've just produced the most accurate possible catapult in a nuclear world. They're driving while other people are flying. They've produced an amazing TV antenna while everybody else is watching Netflix. Let me explain what I mean by those statements, because to me, this process showed me three things. Firstly, the Bifrost 2 is still, to me, the best DAC under $900 US. The Schiit Labs J2S will definitely have something to say about that, particularly with different op amps. But to me, the Bifrost 2 in this lineup was the DAC that I would want to keep in my system. What this also showed me is that the interface on the D90 Mark III is now severely outdated for a $900 DAC, and its sound quality doesn't make up for the difference. And then what that leads us to is the fact that if you're looking for a fantastic sounding DAC with an outstanding interface that's both intuitive and easy to use, but also great to look at, then you can choose between the D70 Pro OCTO or the EverSolo DAC-Z8 and get wonderful interfaces, beautiful DAC designs, and really no significant sonic compromises. I would absolutely choose to use either the D70 Pro OCTO or the EverSolo DAC-Z8 every single day over the D90 Mark III. I just don't see why the D90 Mark III exists in this day and age, other than to prove on paper that Topping can make the best possible THD in a DAC. Now, to be clear, if you want a DAC that sounds excellent, you really want I2S, and you're happy to spend $900 US, the D90 Mark III is a really solid DAC. I just think it's a little bit irrelevant. And also make sure you go check out some other reviews and see if anybody else had issues with I2S. Maybe it was an issue with my source chain, maybe I got a dead unit, I'm not entirely sure. So check that out before you make any purchases for the I2S connection. But beyond that, if you don't need I2S, I think there's better choices out there. For now though, as always, I want to send a huge thanks to channel members, to channel Patreon members, and to those of you that leave super thanks here on videos. If you've enjoyed this video, and maybe you're looking for what is the best DAC under $900 US, I've got another video up here that you should check out to properly understand the best choice for you under that budget. In the meantime, happy listening, be kind to each other, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.